Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going way back in time to take a look at the life of Saddam Hussein. But we're not looking at the brutal dictator we've all come to know. Instead, we're looking at the man behind the myth, the man behind the curtain. We're going to be focusing on his extravagant lifestyle, the palaces, the lavish feasts, the whole 9 yards. And we'll try to figure out why he was so obsessed with all this luxury.
Yeah, it really is fascinating, isn't it? A man ruling with an iron fist, but living a life of, well, ultimate luxury.
This paradox, for sure. And to kind of guide us through this deep dive, we're going to be looking at a proposed podcast script. It's actually titled The Luxury Lifestyle of Saddam Hussein.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we'll be diving into a world of excess, trying to figure out the why behind all the what. I mean, what was it about luxury that appealed to Saddam so much? And maybe more importantly, how did it factor into his decades-long grip on power?
Right, right. Well, to really understand Saddam, I think we have to rewind the clock a bit, all the way back to July 22nd, 1979. This date, it's a pivotal moment for understanding Saddam's mindset. It all went down in a smoky room filled with high-ranking members of the Ba'ath Party.
The Ba'ath Party, that was the political party that ruled Iraq, right?
Exactly. Now, picture this. Saddam's just sitting there, puffing on a Cohiba cigar, casually calling out names.
That sounds like something out of a movie.
Except these weren't names being called for applause. These were the names of people who were about to be executed, right there in that room.
Oh, wow. So he's literally deciding who lives and who dies, and he's just casually smoking a cigar.
That's Saddam for you. This was a blatant power move. It solidified his control over the party and essentially over Iraq itself.
Wow, and you think this moment, this chilling display of power, that it somehow fueled his desire for more?
I think it's very possible. I mean, think about it. The palaces, all the gold, the lavish feasts, it was all about sending a message. I am in control. I am above you.
Yeah, it was all part of the image, wasn't it?
Absolutely. This carefully constructed image was projected onto the Iraqi people and the world.
Okay, so let's talk about the palaces. I mean, I know he had a lot of them.
He didn't just have a few. He had dozens of sprawling estates all across Iraq.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And some historians believe these palaces weren't just about showing off. They're actually a strategy rooted in paranoia.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Saddam was surrounded by enemies, real or imagined, so he needed secure bases wherever he went.
Right.
And I guess if you're going to have a secure base, might as well make it a palace, right?
When you put it like that.
And that's where the Al-Fa Palace comes in. This wasn't just any palace. It was massive, with huge halls, artificial lakes, even gold-plated toilets.
Gold-plated toilets.
Gold-plated toilets.
Wow.
It's hard to even imagine that kind of opulence when you think about the struggles of ordinary Iraqis under his rule.
Yeah, that's a stark contrast for sure.
It really speaks to the dynamics of his regime.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how this extravagant lifestyle was all part of a bigger strategy.
It was all about projecting an image of absolute power.
Yeah, and keeping himself separate, above the struggles of his people.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the palaces. This taste for extravagance, it extended to every part of his life. European designer suits, imported delicacies, these insane feasts.
Wow, it sounds like he spared no expense.
Nope. And it was all carefully calculated to build this persona.
This aura of a godlike figure.
Untouchable and above it all.
Right.
And speaking of image, we can't forget about one of his most iconic accessories.
Oh, you mean the Cohiba cigars?
The one and only.
Yeah, it's hard to picture Saddam without one.
It became a symbol of his dictatorship.
Do you think he was aware of that, or was it just, a personal preference?
That's a question historians still debate today. Was it a deliberate power play, or just something he enjoyed?
Right.
Either way, the Cohiba, with its luxury and exclusivity, it played right into the image he was crafting.
It was subtle, but effective.
Very effective.
So we've got the palaces, the feasts, the cigars, all meticulously chosen to create this aura of power and dominance. But you can't have all this luxury without a serious amount of cash.
And Saddam had more than enough. Estimates place his personal fortune in the billions.
Billions. Where did all that money come from?
Well, Iraq was sitting on a sea of oil, and Saddam basically treated the nation's wealth as his own personal piggy bank.
Wow.
He siphoned off funds from those oil reserves and stashed them away in hidden Swiss bank accounts.
It was all about keeping it out of sight.
Out of sight and out of reach.
And it wasn't until after his capture that the world really saw the scale of his financial maneuvering.
Right. And this wasn't just about personal enrichment. These vast sums of money were also a tool for maintaining power.
I can see how that would be useful.
You could shower supporters with lavish gifts, fund your military, and of course, live like a king.
It all creates this cycle, a cycle that's very hard to break.
It's a vicious cycle for sure.
And it wasn't just Saddam who enjoyed this wealth, was it?
No, it wasn't.
His sons, Uday and Qasem, weren't exactly known for their frugality.
Oh, Uday and Qasem, they inherited their father's taste for the finer things in life.
So they lived lives of, well, basically privilege and power.
They did. Wild parties, expensive cars. They even created their own brutal mini-regimes within Iraq.
It's like they took their father's playbook and cranked it up to 11.
That's one way to put it. And Uday in particular was known for his, his sadistic tendencies.
Really?
Oh, yeah. He used his wealth and power to terrorize Iraq's elite.
It's a dark reminder of how absolute power can corrupt.
Especially when it's coupled with immense wealth.
A dark side of human nature that unfortunately we see play out time and time again.
You're absolutely right.
But before we go any further, I think it's important to pause here and just consider the contrast. On one hand, you have Saddam and his sons living these incredibly opulent lives. But on the other hand, you have the Iraqi people living under this oppressive regime, often facing hardship and fear.
That contrast is key to understanding Saddam's rule.
For sure. It's a fascinating and disturbing story. And, well, we've only just scratched the surface. We'll be back in just a minute to delve deeper into the world of Saddam Hussein and how he used luxury as a tool of power, control, and ultimately his own downfall.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in all the glitz and glamour of Saddam's lifestyle. But we can't lose sight of the bigger picture. This isn't just about one man's extravagance. It's about a system built on fear and oppression, and how that system impacted millions of Iraqis.
Right. We've been talking about gold toilets and lavish feasts. But what about the people living under his rule? What was their reality like?
Well, that's where the real tragedy lies. While Saddam was indulging in, well, basically every luxury imaginable, many Iraqis were facing economic hardship, political repression, and often brutal violence.
It's hard to imagine living with that constant fear, that sense of being watched.
That's the essence of a dictatorship, silencing any kind of dissent. And Saddam was a master at it.
He created this cult of personality around himself, the strong leader, the protector of the nation.
But behind that facade was a much darker reality.
Yeah, he was running a police state, wasn't he?
Essentially, yes. He had the Republican Guard, an elite military force, totally loyal to him.
They were responsible for putting down any uprisings, right?
Exactly. And let's not forget the propaganda machine. The newspapers, television, radio, all tightly controlled. Only the approved narrative reached the public.
So he's controlling the flow of information.
Yeah.
Creating this climate of fear and eliminating his opponents.
It was a chillingly effective way to maintain power.
And it worked for decades.
While he was projecting this image of strength and prosperity to the outside world, the reality for most Iraqis was very different.
That gap between perception and reality is really striking.
It's one of the most important things to understand about his regime.
So how did he get away with it for so long?
Well, he was a master manipulator. He played on people's fears and exploited divisions within Iraqi society.
Ethnic and religious divisions.
Exactly. He pitted groups against each other, preventing any kind of unified opposition from forming.
Divide and conquer, a classic tactic.
Very effective. And of course, there was the oil money.
Right, the vast wealth generated by Iraq's oil industry.
It gave Saddam the resources he needed to stay in power.
He could buy loyalty, fund his military.
And of course, keep up his extravagant lifestyle.
It's this vicious cycle.
The oil money fuels the dictatorship,
Right.
which uses that money to further consolidate its power.
And it wasn't just internal forces that kept him in power, was it? The international community played a role too.
You're absolutely right. During the Cold War, Iraq was strategically important. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union saw Saddam as a potential ally.
So they turned a blind eye to his human rights abuses.
To a certain extent, yes. They were more concerned with maintaining their influence in the region.
So the Cold War actually helped to keep him in power.
In a way, yes. And even after the Cold War ended, Saddam remained a key player in the Middle East.
He was seen as a counterbalance to Iran.
Exactly. And some Western countries continued to overlook his actions, all in the name of maintaining a balance of power.
It's complicated, isn't it?
It highlights the complexities of international relations and the challenges of dealing with authoritarian regimes.
Looking back, it's easy to ask, should we have intervened earlier?
But there are no easy answers. What we can do is learn from the past and try to prevent these situations from happening again.
Well said. So after decades in power, Saddam's regime finally came to an end in 2003. With the U.S.-led invasion,
Right.
what were the key events that led to his downfall?
I think the 9/11 attacks were a turning point. The Bush administration saw Saddam as a threat. They accused him of developing WMDs and having ties to al-Qaeda.
Accusations that later proved to be false?
Yes, but at the time they were used to justify the invasion.
And once U.S. forces entered Baghdad, Saddam's regime crumbled quickly.
He went into hiding, but was eventually captured and put on trial for crimes against humanity.
And in 2006, he was executed.
With his death, an era came to an end.
But his legacy, that's something that continues to shape Iraq today.
It's a complicated legacy, full of contradictions.
On one hand, he left behind a country scarred by violence and repression.
His regime created deep divisions within Iraqi society, divisions that still fuel conflict and instability today.
And the war and its aftermath only made things worse.
Right.
So he's gone. But the wounds he inflicted on Iraq are still very much open.
That's true. But it's important to remember that Saddam wasn't the only factor. Iraq has a long and complex history. Its current challenges are rooted in many things: colonialism, regional rivalries, internal political struggles.
It's never just one thing, is it?
It's a nuanced picture.
It's a good reminder that history is messy.
And understanding it requires looking at the whole picture.
Absolutely.
And speaking of the bigger picture, I think it's important to circle back to the human cost of Saddam's regime. Behind the palaces and the propaganda, there were real people whose lives were shattered.
We can't forget about the victims.
The countless Iraqis who were imprisoned, tortured, or killed.
Their stories need to be heard.
And we need to remember the Iraqi people who are still struggling with the consequences of his rule. The violence, the instability, the hardship.
It's a testament to their resilience that they continue to strive for a better future.
It's incredible, isn't it?
It's a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable hardship, the human spirit can endure.
I agree.
So we've covered a lot of ground. Saddam's opulent lifestyle, the brutality of his regime, his rise to power, and his eventual downfall. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to ask you about something that's been on my mind. We've talked about how Saddam used luxury to project power and control, but I'm curious about the psychology behind it all. Was there something deeper going on, something beyond just the love of expensive things?
I think that's a really interesting question. It gets at what motivated Saddam, what made him tick. You know, it goes beyond just the material things, the palaces, the gold, all the extravagance. It was about crafting an image, creating a persona that served his political goals.
So he was using luxury as a tool to influence how people saw him.
Precisely. It's about dominance, about control. By surrounding himself with all this opulence, he was sending a very clear message. I'm powerful, I'm untouchable, I'm above you.
It's almost like a peacock flashing its feathers.
I like that, a great analogy. Projecting an image of strength and invincibility to his people and to the world. Don't forget, Saddam craved recognition on the global stage. He wanted to be seen as a force to be reckoned with.
And the luxury was his way of achieving that?
In a way, yes. It was a way to compensate for what he might have perceived as his own shortcomings. He came from a pretty humble background, so the extravagance was maybe a way to overcompensate, to prove his worth, assert his dominance.
It's like he was saying, look at me now, I'm in control.
Exactly, and this need for control, it went beyond just image. He had to control his environment, every detail, every interaction. The palaces, those massive opulent spaces, they allowed him to do just that.
He created his own little world, a world where he made the rules.
And in that world, luxury had a very specific purpose. It was a way to reward loyalty, to inspire awe, to separate himself from everyone else.
It was all about maintaining that hierarchy, that sense of I am above you.
It was. And this wasn't just about his own personal gratification. It was a calculated strategy. By cultivating this aura of invincibility, this larger-than-life persona, he discouraged any dissent and solidified his control.
So the luxury, as strange as it sounds, was a way to survive politically.
It was. It was a means of projecting strength, controlling the narrative, intimidating his rivals.
We've talked about Saddam using luxury to project this image of power, but was there a downside to it? Did his obsession with all this extravagance contribute to his downfall?
That's an interesting point. While the luxury might have helped him for a while, it also created a dangerous disconnect between him and the realities of the Iraqi people. He was living in opulent palaces, while many of his citizens were struggling to get by. They were dealing with poverty, sanctions, and the fallout of his policies.
So the thing that helped him rise to power ultimately played a role in his demise.
It's a classic case of hubris. The palaces, the lavish spending, it created a bubble around him, a bubble that blinded him to the realities on the ground. The discontent among his own people, the shifting global landscape.
Even the most powerful dictators can fall, and sometimes their own excesses can contribute to their downfall.
It's true.
Saddam's story, it's a cautionary tale. It's a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked.
And we can't forget about the human cost. The victims, the families torn apart by his regime, those are the legacies that truly endure.
You've given our listeners a lot to think about. We've explored Saddam's world, his motivations, his rise and fall. It's been quite a journey.
A fascinating one, that's for sure.
To all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative. History is filled with stories like Saddam's. Keep exploring, keep learning. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.